Too many businesses are losing money on their second highest fixed expense, and it doesn't have to be this way. At Riata Commercial Realty, we only represent occupiers. So we are 100% on your side as we negotiate your commercial space, whether for lease or purchase. Landlords have representation. Do you? In today's podcast, we're going to talk about the $64,000 question. How much office space do you need? Are you going to let our listeners know what the answer to the $64,000 question is today?
I thought it was $1 million question.
Oh, well, depends on the size of your space, I reckon, but we'll get there eventually.
So the question is,
how much office space do you need?
As much as I can humanly find for you to lease.
Oh, I like the sound of that. That's the answer for me. We're
Actually,
talking about our clients.
The actual answer is as little as possible that still allows you to fully and effectively accomplish the corporate goals and objectives.
What the answer I think of is one more square foot than you need. Because I remember when I was selling insurance, they always asked, how much liability should I buy? And our answer, $1 more than you're going to get sued for. There's no good answer for it. But some of the things we've seen recently is a brand new lease for a McAfee spinoff called Project Cheetah at 6,000 Headquarters Drive in Plano. And they are taking 85,000 square feet in that lease.
Nice deal.
But a couple of weeks back, we noticed a new sublease coming on the market for Riata Pharmaceuticals, no relation, sorry
Sadly.
to say. They decided not to occupy their space at 6,100 Legacy Drive of 327,400 square feet. So what does Project Cheetah know that Riata didn't?
Well, number one, they're in different businesses. And it's actually kind of interesting because when the Riata Pharmaceuticals building was being proposed for construction, I was on the Planning and Zoning Commission here in Plano and was, cast a vote to approve that deal. So it's kind of interesting to see how it then became this great announcement of Riata Pharmaceuticals, the lease, and they've been growing like crazy, but then their stock tanked pretty badly. And all of a sudden their space is on the sublease market. So I don't know that there's really anything in particular to draw a conclusion from those two particular issues or statements. But, ultimately it does bring up the issue though of, decisions have to be made and plans executed. And so Riata Pharmaceuticals had to make the decision to sign that lease for a brand new building to be built. It was dirt when they were, negotiating that deal. That had to be decided long ago because it takes, a year or two for a building to be built. And so somebody made that decision, let's say back in early 2020 to make this. Yeah. And now things have changed. So you have to continually reevaluate and change your strategies, not just for the real estate, but for everything else as new information becomes available.
I like the little ancient wisdom of plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors, they succeed. And that's our friend David out of Proverbs.
Actually, that was Solomon.
It was his one of those old dudes with a long beard. But I really liked that because it's so true. You need a lot of people on your team to help you make that decision. Management, attorney, accountant, business coach, HR consultant, financial advisor, and the most important,
David George of Crux Workplace. Oh, was that not what you were going for?
No, he can be the second important one, but I had someone else in mind.
David was our guest on our last podcast episode. Mm-hmm. I think that was episode 80, I want to say.
Yes.
And so he's with Crux Workplace, a company based out of the UK with offices in the US as well. But, his business was interesting because he helps companies evaluate and implement a hybrid work model. And so he's always working with, big companies around the world to try and figure out what it is they're going to do, what they're going to become. And, they have a process to go through that. But I think what you were really trying to say is one of the most important advisors would be your real estate advisor and tenant advocate, also known as Riata
Riata.
Commercial Realty. That would be us. Yeah. And that is kind of a self-serving plug, but it's true. I mean, I tell people after having been a landlord for 20 years, the single best thing that they can do to ensure that they get a fair deal is to hire a corporate real estate advisor, also known as a tenant rep.
Because
Which,
the landlord has representation.
well, not only do they have representation, but they also are in the business of real estate. So most landlords, for any building of size, they're in that business full time, and they hire property management leasing companies to represent them. And they're in the business full time. So they do hundreds, if not thousands of deals a year, and companies that lease space in buildings or buy a building for that matter, they're in a different business. They could be in software development, or they could be in financial services, or who knows what. So they just need to have the knowledge of the market on their side that a tenant rep brings to the table.
Well, and speaking of market knowledge, there's quite a bit of stuff going on right now between subleases and businesses cutting space, or no, we're finding out they're not cutting space. I mean, what is it that you're seeing coming to the forefront in a lot of this?
Well, let's start off with just sublease space, for example. The amount of sublease space in the U.S. as a whole has fallen a bit. It's a little bit less than what was on the market before. So if you look at how things have changed from 208.8 million square feet in just a quarter ago to about 199.7 million square feet now. That's good news. I mean, we see that falling. So hopefully that will continue to fall. And I think that's the second consecutive quarter of falling sublease space available on the market. So that definitely makes a difference. It was interesting as well that 1/5 of that whole space is in Manhattan.
And the second highest?
Your friend and mine, Dallas Fort Worth. And so Manhattan had 18.6 million square feet of sublease space on the market, and Dallas Fort Worth had 9.8. And again, this all depends on whose numbers you're looking at. But
Right.
I've seen various numbers, and just going and talking to brokers, tenant rep brokers and landlord brokers, the most recent numbers I'm hearing about in the DFW area is more like 10 to 11 million square feet. But we're not seeing big numbers coming on the market anymore. The other ones that were in the top four. So I mentioned Manhattan, Dallas, then Washington, D.C. with 9.7 million, and San Francisco with 7.9 million. So those are the biggest markets for sublease space.
Yeah. Although with like Riata Pharmaceuticals coming online, that was a big boost at 350,000 square feet there. It's not into the millions, but there's definitely an accordion action going on there.
Yeah, for sure. And what's interesting also is if you look at what are the average discounts that are being given for subleases, the Class A direct versus sublease space ranges between 25 and 30%, averaging 25.8%. And that's a pretty decent, a discount. So if, your rental rate is being quoted by the landlord on a direct deal is $40, that means that for a sublease, you should expect to pay $29 or $30 a square foot. So that's a pretty substantial difference.
Right.
And,
but you're not getting to customize it. You're getting no TIs. You have to take the space as is with all the conditions the primary tenant signed up for.
In most cases, that's true. However, in some cases, there is TI available. For example, the Riata Pharmaceuticals deal, I would bet you that has TIs available to it because they probably had not finished building that out since it was a brand new build. Space. So occasionally you will find some of that, but most of the time you're right, that's not available. But whenever you start getting into like central business districts, the discount can go much higher. I mean, in Houston and Dallas, for example, the Houston discount is 50%, and in Dallas is 35%.
Houston is always so much more volatile because a lot of it is driven off oil and energy.
That's exactly right. So, ongoing story of sublease space being a big question mark. But I found this one to be very interesting. There was a study done by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And in that study, they said that only 5.5% of businesses have reduced their office space since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. That's a shockingly low number.
Is that because they can't give it back? They can't get it sublet. They're forced to keep it. Why do you think that's not contracting more?
It's a good question. I mean, one, their leases haven't expired, so they're not having to contract. They have decided not to put space on the sublease market for whatever reason. I don't know the answer to that because they didn't really give us any specific answers in their study. But, they said that only 5.5% have reduced their space. And yet the next thing it says is that 90% haven't changed their square footage, which is kind of a weird thing because if they say only 5.5% has changed their square footage, actually, I guess not have reduced their square footage, but 90% haven't changed. There are some that have increased their square footage. We have clients that have expanded during this period of time. So that would account for that difference. But 2/3 of employers said that their companies plan to redesign their spaces for hybrid working. So when they do that, you would think that that might entail some reductions that haven't yet occurred.
It could, but it also could go from a lot of conference space into smaller offices that might eat up the same amount of space, but you're trying to separate people so they have a little bit more of the barrier.
Well, in September of last year, 21, Gensler, the big architectural firm, they did a survey and found that 44% of companies that they surveyed expected that they would downsize the office. So
after the pandemic ends. And when will that be? And I don't think it's going to end. I think it's going to morph into something else.
It very well could be. But of course, you would expect that the most likely kind of industry to downsize is going to be like information companies because they can do that work from a lot of different places. Whereas other ones like mining, construction, retail, they can't really cut their space as much. In fact, only 2% of the natural resources and mining companies have downsized, according to that study.
Okay, now that sounds funny. They mean the corporate office, right? I can't rent a smaller cave in which to do my mining.
Yes, this was an office study. So good point. Well, the other thing that I thought was interesting of this study is that it said that 38% of large enterprise occupiers are using flexible space. And actually, this is not according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is according to CBRE. But when they're
define
using
flex, are they talking like the industrial warehouse, or are they talking about WeWork?
They're not talking about office warehouse space. They're talking about the WeWork.
Okay.
So that's going to be the co-working and the executive suite. So 38% using some form of that. I mean, they may have one person in Boise using something like that, but so I think that's reasonable. And a lot of them are using it whenever they want to enter into a new market. And we saw that one of our clients is a bank from Midland, Texas, and they came into the market and we told them, you know what, just go into a co-working place. And they went into a common desk for, I think, 3 years until they were ready to get their own space. And they did that actually this year. They signed it last year, but they moved in at the end of last year, first this year. So anyway.
So what are you seeing percentage wise as far as renewals versus new stuff coming online? Brand new people coming in and leasing space?
I don't have a number for that. I mean, there's a lot of companies that are moving to Dallas, moving to Texas in general, moving out of higher cost and more highly regulated areas like California. But I don't really have a percentage that I've seen that, I could give you that says that.
Okay, well, I do.
Oh, good. Do it. Lay it on me.
It shows the last 3 quarters of 2020, nearly half of office transactions were renewals.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
But 23% of leasing deals during that period involved a relocation and only 17% involved expansions. Now, this data is 1.5 years old now. So, in comparison to the first 3 quarters of 2021, just 32% of transactions involved renewals. So clearly, that went down a lot in just a couple of quarters difference.
Yeah, but that makes sense because the first numbers that you mentioned from 2020, that the pandemic was new. Nobody knew what was going on. They didn't know which way was up, and everybody was just trying to kick the can down the road and do 6-month, 12-month, 18-month extensions.
Yeah, they didn't say how
lease.
long the renewal was, because we definitely did that with some of our clients.
Quite a bit of them.
In flux.
Whereas by the time you get into 2021, people are feeling a little bit more confident of the future that, yeah, we may be living with the pandemic, or at least the coronavirus. I shouldn't call it a pandemic. It may be moving to an endemic status instead of a pandemic status. And in that case, all right, well, we got to look to the future, right? So, we're going to go ahead and do a renewal or an expansion or a whatever.
Now, it also shows that leasing activity overall rose once again in Q3 2021, most notably in secondary markets. What is deemed a secondary market?
Well, that's a good question, because I would argue that has changed. It used to be that the primary markets were New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, these kind of places. Secondary markets back then would have been Dallas, Seattle, Atlanta, Denver, Phoenix. But some of that has changed.
Mo.
Yeah, I mean, Dallas has really come on, and I would argue Atlanta as well. And they've become really primary destinations, and a lot of people, a lot of big companies are going there, and a lot of investors are going there to buy. And so, the pandemic has really kind of changed how people view secondary or markets or tertiary markets.
And then again, the other $64,000 question is, how is all this info affecting rental rates?
Not like they should. We've talked about this many times, and it's still baffling that you have falling demand and increasing supply, and the rental rates still don't change. It is absolutely maddening. And
I think that just says that landlords have deeper pockets than we thought. If they were hurting, we'd start seeing it.
Well, it's a combination, I think, of landlords having deeper pockets and lenders not wanting to take buildings back.
So they're extending grace.
I mean, buildings were pretty highly occupied before the pandemic started. So, a lot of those leases are still being paid, and they're not, when you look at like Dallas and say we have a 30% vacancy rate, well, that includes some of that sublease space that's out there, which is still being paid for on a monthly basis. So
it's vacant, but occupied.
Yeah, but the landlords aren't feeling that pinch, and therefore the lenders aren't feeling that pinch. But in those buildings where they are, the lenders don't want those buildings back, so they're not foreclosing on them in a lot of cases. So it's a combination of factors as to what's happening with the rents. But, we have seen an uptick in the tenant incentives, which on average means that your true rental rate has come down, but the face rate has not. And in fact, we've done some deals recently. We were laughing about a deal we were doing last week where our client has a space in the building already. They want to expand and extend their lease. And the landlord was quoting a $20 rental rate. This is downtown Dallas. And so it's $20 plus electric, pretty inexpensive rental rate. So we go to the landlord, ask for a proposal. They give us a proposal at like $22.50 or something. I'm like, what are you doing? How do you justify quoting us a $22.50 rental rate when you're quoting $20 a square foot on the market? And to anybody new coming in the door, well, they didn't really answer the question. And next thing I know, I go into CoStar and I look, and they're, guess what, quoting $22 a foot now. So it's like a little smoke and mirrors. And, they're feeling a little bit fat and happy because they signed a big lease of like 166,000 square feet and during the pandemic. But that tenant, or just before that pandemic, and that tenant has now decided they're really not going to occupy that space. But guess what? The landlord's getting paid on it.
It's like my daddy used to say, don't let your hummingbird mouth overload your alligator mouth overload your hummingbird behind. I edited that for
Yeah,
podcast
I was going to
purposes.
say,
But that's,
well,
I thought that was pretty funny because clearly no one had gone into their database to see what the posted rental rate was when they quoted that to you.
right.
And so, that kind of left everyone hanging.
Well, part of it's also because, they're going in and they're looking at what the tenant's paying currently. And if it's higher than what
Mm-hmm.
the landlord is now quoting, they don't want to reduce it for the tenant. And so, I understand why they're doing what they're doing. It's hard. It's hard for them to justify, especially given the market conditions that are out there.
Well,
But
again, they think that either the client is not represented or not represented well if they don't think that you're double checking the price they're quoting on the major national database.
I don't think they're that naive to think that we're not looking at it. I think they're just trying to keep their client happy and not chip away at that face rate.
Yeah. So stay tuned for what the market will bear and the roller coaster ride that we like to call CRE.
Hey, one other thing I do want to mention real quick before we sign off. There's been a flight to quality in all this. And so companies are tending to lease in nicer buildings, newer buildings, because, it's real easy to justify a $55 rental rate when you're only going to lease 30,000 square feet instead of 120,000 square feet at $25 a foot or, $80 or $40 a foot, whatever. And so we're seeing a lot of flight to quality. What that does is that means that the rental rate of the deals actually happening is higher.
Because their overall rent is still lower than what they were paying previously. And
Well,
that's what they're looking at is the bottom line.
Well, but what I'm saying is that the price per square foot that is being quoted or that's actually happening. If you just look at the actual rental rate of deals that are occurring, it's higher because more people are doing deals in the higher end buildings.
Right.
Now,
because that tenant is still paying a lower rental price because they leased fewer square feet.
The dollars per month that they're writing the check for. Yeah.
Right.
Not the rate, but
not the rate.
Total dollar amount. Yes. But so I think that's having an impact. Now, if you just look at what's the quoted rate, that doesn't explain that. And so that's where I'm looking at this and saying the quoted rate seems to be holding on more tenaciously than it should. And yeah, all the new buildings that are being built have a really high rate. So you could argue that influences that. But, the percentage of the overall market that's coming on new is not high enough to drastically prop that up. So landlords are definitely still hanging on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast, brought to you by
Retracting Commercial Realty,
where we always put the occupier first. Thanks for listening.
Bye. We'll see you next week. And please tell someone else about it. Hopefully we can help them too.